Dr. Morne Mostert, welcome to NineLeaders. Are you keeping well today?
Very well indeed, Andrew. Great to be with you.
Great, thanks. And really, I do appreciate your time and you taking the effort to be here. A little bit of context as to how we met very briefly. It was probably about 2 years ago. You were doing a presentation under the Institute for Futures Research and the University of Stellenbosch, just on the way forward for South Africa. And you had some interesting points of view around the models that you use in the Institute and where you saw the country going potentially with the different options. So I thought it was only relevant to have you as one of our first guests on board, really looking at the future and what the future holds for us, not only as a country, but as a globe, if I can put it that way. You currently head up the Institute for Futures Research at the University of Stellenbosch, as well as you're a full member of the Club of Rome, which is very, very exciting from a global side of things. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to what you do for these organizations and really what these organizations really stand for?
Yes, Andrew, thank you. The Institute for Futures Research was the first and remains the only such institute on the African continent, which is entirely dedicated to the methods of interrogating the future. And we were established in 1974 with the express purpose of taking a longer term view at that time, specifically from a business perspective, taking a long-term view on the implications for business decision making, having a contextual perspective. Now, what's really interesting about the connection between the IFR and the Club of Rome is that the IFR was in fact established as the direct result of the launch of the first major report by the Club of Rome with the title Limits to Growth. This is a publication that...
Mid-1960s, is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, it was published in 1972.
Apologies. Yep.
And a well-known South African business person was invited, and it was such a breakthrough idea that we couldn't perpetuate this model of industrial growth. And it was such a fundamentally disturbing idea that this person came back to South Africa, approached Stellenbosch University, and in fact, the Institute for Futures Research was born.
That's awesome. And when you say the growth, are you talking about the scalability of industrialization and the whole industrial model of that the world had been in the last 200 years, that it's not necessarily feasible going into the future?
Yeah, that's right. It's really challenging the dominant paradigm that growth is in and of itself the answer to everything. And the title, you can just imagine at the time, that the title, Limits to Growth, must have given every self-respecting capitalist a little minor heart attack. Could there be a challenge to this notion of growth when growth was really so fundamentally held as, in a way, the only way out? It's really quite fascinating when you look around the world today, almost 50 years later, that much of that growth paradigm, that growth mindset persists. And still, despite what's going on in the climate, and despite what's going on in inequality, and despite what's going on in harm to so many in so many communities all around the world, growth seems to be a kind of passionate concern still for many leaders all around the world. And in fact, it's time, I think, that now, if we haven't done it sooner, it's certainly time now that we must, in a very significant way, revisit that idea.
So we're talking about growth. How much of it is related to consumption and just the accumulation of wealth, rather than growth across the board for majority of the people necessarily? Are those two ideas related or linked?
They are related, and the first concern is the mere notion that simply producing more and consuming more is the way out of poverty. And in fact, it's a deluded idea. Now, of course, the reality is that the world is vastly unequal.
Hmm.
And so the real question is whether the traditional models of growth, and this is a highly contentious and challenging intellectual conundrum, is the idea of helping people out of poverty, that we should simply ratchet up the kind of growth which the rest of the world has enjoyed for at least 2 centuries.
Yeah.
Or do we now, and this is really the more recent shift, do we now attempt a reinvention of the global economic and financial system and try to think of alternative models? Because actually, Andrew, in reality, it is impossible for the planet to sustain the lifestyles that wealthy people in the West enjoy today. In other words, if everyone on the planet lived the same way that wealthy people lived, we would need 3 more planets. In other words, the theory that all that should happen is we should keep growing so that poor people can also be rich like rich people and live in the same way using the same economic model is in fact a deluded idea. So new models are therefore necessary. In future science, we say the current model can only ever produce the current future. In other words, keep going the way you're going now, you will create a thing called the current future. The current future will be an intensified version of the status quo. The status quo is already undesirable. An intensified version of that will therefore be utterly undesirable, and in the view of some, utterly disastrous.
So does it mean
alternative economic models around, for example, a more circular perspective on economics, rather than a traditional pyramid-based structure pushed by growth on this deluded theory of trickle-down economics, is simply, in fact, we're coming to a point now where it's ludicrous to keep talking about the same idea, when quite patently it's not going to produce the solutions that we aspire to. So this has moved away from, in the 1960s, 1970s, this was a lunatic fringe idea. This was, crazy hippies with hair like mine, bemoaning the fate of the universe and, down with growth and so on. It was really a fringe, crazy, mad idea. And it's important to understand that context when this powerful visionary report by the Club of Rome appeared. It was dismissed as kind of communist rah-rah.
Yeah.
Well, today we can see the results of a growth-dominated paradigm with little or no respect for the consequences of social well-being and the consequences of ecological well-being. It is an utterly, utterly unsustainable model. And so as a futurist, I'm deeply fascinated by the alternative paths that we could follow towards a preferred future.
Is it a case of, and like you said, it's now 50 years almost from the time that report is published. Is it about, has it not grown legs because of protectionism from that sort of that political economic elite? Or do you think, has it gained ground? Let's put it that way. Is it come to a point now where we have no choice but to change?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think one of the reasons is that we're finding that the current model is not only outdated and highly damaging, but it's actually unaffordable. We're now starting to learn about planetary limits, the limits that the planet inevitably will present, and the limits of the notion of a kind of infinite, endless, boundless growth available for everyone. That theory is just falling to pieces, essentially with the insight that we have now on the limitations that the planet is presenting us with.
Yeah.
So I think it is true that there are still many people that pursue that model, that think the goal should be that everyone should have a massive house with multiple fossil fuel burning electricity supply, a large number of cars that also burn fossil fuel and rubber, and that actually that is the ideal model for the planet. The reality is, just again, if everybody lived like that, we wouldn't have enough planet.
So this begs the question as to how do you change that framework?
Yeah.
And I think the whole period through COVID has that presented us an opportunity to press the reset button, not just to innovate the way we do things, but to really reinvent the structures and frameworks that have been in place for so long.
Yes, that's right. What is the nature of that shift? And I'm really deeply curious about what is that theory of change? How does it work? The reality is that for some, there is always a benefit in the status quo. Some people always benefit from the way things are today. And when those people have an enormous amount of wealth and influence and power, well, what would possibly be their motivation to change? In fact, they will perpetuate that lunacy, even in the guise that it will continue to be in the interest of the poor, as indeed we saw Donald Trump do.
So it really is that on that scale of what we spoke about earlier, the collaboration and cohesion versus the self-interest, on the opposite scale, that factionalization and the self-interest portion trumps a lot of the general betterment for humanity, if we can put it that way.
Precisely correct. And I mean, in Trump's case, for example, he'd really tried to play it both ways in saying, firstly, let's promote factionalism, separate America from the rest of the world, in a sense, what Brexit is trying to do, but also even then claiming that his economic proposals are indeed in the interest of the economically marginalized, which of course makes his proposals even more ludicrous to entertain.
And going back to that from an economic side of things, one of the policies is that industrialization, which you spoke about previously, reinventing manufacturing in the States, et cetera, et cetera. The Club of Rome published a paper of yours with regards to the United Nations African Industrialization Day. And it's gained quite a bit of interest. How does that line up with what you're expounding around the pitfalls of industrialization?
Well, in that paper, I focused specifically on Africa, my mother continent, the birthplace of humanity. And I was really interested in thinking about how the history and current practices around debt in Africa may, in fact, perpetuate an outdated paradigm of Africa. There's this pervasive idea that Africa, which of course is not one thing, it's 54 countries, yet the rest of the world continue to lump it with countries like, it's an often heard phrase, India, China, Africa, and other countries. Of course, it's immensely diverse, over 2,000 languages. 1 out of every 6 humans on the planet lives in Africa. By the mid to late 2040s, 4 out of every 10 young people on the planet will be an African. And so when I tried to look at the longer term future of the continent, I became really curious about the role that debt played. So specifically the finance system and how one might finance the development in Africa. Because it is already clear, as I've indicated, that what is intolerable is to suggest that Africa should follow the same industrial development model followed for the last 400 years since the first industrial revolution that was followed by the West. That would in fact make the planet uninhabitable. In fact, it's a good example of even if you succeed at doing it, you would kill everybody. So it is, in other words, an attempt at trying to get better at the wrong thing. And so I was curious about the role that debt played, and the implications became suddenly quite significant for me, because it struck me that there is a pervasive perception of Africa as presenting this enormously high risk profile. And that means that Africa seems to find itself continuously in a kind of debt trap. Indebtedness or debt is the sort of financial version of being behind, in inverted commas.
Yeah.
And the current global financial system is making it extremely difficult for Africa to find its way out of that trap.
So it just perpetuates that entire framework and system effectively, and just creates more and more debt. I think read a report by the UN now I think in April this year that it's going to cost probably in the region of about $500 billion to the African economy due to COVID.
Yeah.
And that's already on top of the debt levels that are already sitting in on the continent. I think we've got in the region of about 10 countries currently that their debt ratio is higher than their GDP growth. So again, that's a really concerning effort, especially when you start talking about the population growth in the next 10 to 15, 20 years.
That's right.
It's just going to deepen and deepen and deepen and really expand that gap between the haves and have-nots. But then from a global side of things, this is a question I've always thought about, is why perpetuate that system from a global perspective, knowing that how many millions of dollars, hundreds of billions, let's put it that way, have been pumped into Africa, and what return on investment are for Western countries getting from that?
Yeah, it's sort of why keep doing it, right? And I think I think you have to think about who the actors are, who the international role players are. And you have to think about who the winners and losers are. So it's really fascinating when you start having a look at it. There have been many attempts to address debt in developing economies. And some of those attempts have been genuine. And it's also true that not all African leaders have managed their sovereign finances with the highest levels of integrity. That's also true. But you really find the kind of exploitative practices in the finance world when you start looking at who's investing, at what levels of risk, and with what levels of return. And so I think, the argument that surely it's not a global conspiracy, obfuscates really the kind of chicanery behind the global financial system and how opportunistic investors manipulate the discrepancies in the risk profile between African nations and so-called Western nations, and exploit it, in fact, for their own short-term gain.
Yeah.
And let me give you an example. So African countries have debt, broad generalization. By the way, your observation about debt to GDP ratio is very interesting, because that ratio is often used to indicate this ludicrously indebted level of African nations. But in fact, the USA has a debt to GDP ratio of more than 100%. European nations have a similarly 100% plus ratio. Greece is an example. It's at about 187%. Germany this year will be around 75%. So that's a very good example. Why, when we talk about Africa, do we use debt to GDP ratio approaching 100% as an indicator of a failed state, when in the West, we take it as par for the course? That must tell you that something else is going on.
Yeah.
There's a sentiment play going on in the finance world, and that play exploits the discrepancies. So what often happens is that African nations have this debt. How do they get themselves out of debt? Well, Brookings, for example, would argue there's only one way to get yourself out of debt, and that is growth. There we are again, right? And you have to get your growth rate to exceed, your sort of the dominant interest rate, primary surplus. Okay, so you can't do that because of other structural failures in your economy, and you have inflationary pressures, and interest rates go up. So now you try to raise money in other ways. So one of the ways they do it is through listing bonds in Europe. Eurobonds, African Eurobonds. But what's fascinating about that is that those bonds are backed by infrastructure projects, right? But the infrastructure projects mature over several decades. And the bond yields are penalized because they come from countries with high risk profiles. So now investors in African Eurobonds profit from the listing of those bonds, while in fact in the long term, African countries suffer greater liquidity damage because the infrastructure projects mature later. Than the payments are due on the bonds. And here's the interesting question. Why are those bonds so heavily subscribed? They're often oversubscribed. Ghana is a recent example. Why are they oversubscribed? Because they present such amazing returns. So one of the proposals I made, for example, is that sovereign risk should in future include a weighting for foreign bond attractiveness. In other words, if you're a sovereign country in Africa, you're offering a bond on the euro market, then the level of attractiveness of that bond should offset your perceived risk profile. Because otherwise, what financiers are doing is they're playing the differential between the sovereign risk and the bond risk, or the sovereign risk and the corporate risk.
Yeah. So from a mindset side of things, when you start talking Western, you mentioned Western frameworks and Western countries pretty much in the same space. I remember drove up to Zambia probably 1999, and we were in a small little village. We were there for about a month, absolutely no infrastructure, no development. That obviously the Zambian war had taken place 20 years earlier. There's complete desertification of the area. And I recall finding a water supply, and it was in the middle of nowhere in the bushes. And there was a little plaque on it saying sponsored by the government of China. And that sort of blew my mind that we were 60 kilometers away from any other building, let's put it that way. And yet here was this one little aspect of investment, if we can put it that way. Is it necessarily a Western ideology or Western countries, or is it pretty much an ideology that's pervasive across the world as to how they view Africa as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a fairly recent question, because of course, typically it was the so-called West that was interested in Africa, and much of that, for a quick 30-second history, came from 1885 with the Berlin Conference, where European countries essentially looked at the African map and chopped it up as if it was their own personal pizza, and they decided, who gets what and who's going to run what, with no consideration for who the local people are, what their customs are, what the migration routes were of animals, the ecological implications, the flow processes and directions of rivers. None of that was taken into consideration. Imagine doing that now. Imagine a few leaders from Africa stand around a table with a map of the United States and say to each other, okay, you take this part, I'll take that part, you take that. I mean, it sounds ludicrous.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. And that's really the Berlin Conference what kicked off this insane perception that Africa is something that must be rescued. Africa is something that must be conquered. It is something primitive and savage that must be overtaken and won and shared among the victors. But of course, the so-called West, and we must also be honest, the West, just like Africa is not a country, the West is also not a country. And not all Western countries were in fact colonialists in Africa. But of course, of late, you're exactly right. Other regions of the world have started to pay real attention to Africa. And so again, one must think about why they have this interest if Africa is such an enormous debt risk. And if Africa is such an investment risk. So if you just look at the last 3 years or so, you will notice international conventions formalizing trade agreements between China and Africa, India and Africa. India decided, for example, recently that they would open 18 new embassies on the African continent.
Sure.
If that's not a signal of a very sincere long-term interest in the continent. And then also Russia. We had some very interesting approaches and an international conference on the role that Russia would like to play in its relationship with Africa. So if you just think about China, 1/6 of the world's population, India, another roughly 1/6 of the world's population, and Russia, all scrambling in the so-called new scramble for Africa, well, that tells you something of how they're looking at the potential of the future of the continent. Now, I want to just come back very briefly to the idea of population growth that you mentioned in Africa.
Yeah.
And in my paper, I talk about the idea of value and how Africa is valued, the extent to which Africa has been valued in the past. Certainly the Berlin Conference is an expression of a very strange way to value Africa. When you look at how some companies on the continent have behaved and their damage to local populations and the ecosystem, then one wouldn't say that's a very appreciative approach to Africa. Now, when we think about the population in Africa, it is true that it has a very particular demographic profile, and it is set to grow dramatically in the next 2 to 3 decades. Now, very often from the so-called West, then, we have this kind of, high eyebrow approach to this demographic profile. It's almost as if they want to say, well, Africa is already such a poor region, can they really afford this kind of demographic profile? When you start to look a little bit more closely and appreciatively at Africa, one of the things I had a really close look at is the way that Africa thinks about itself. And again, it's almost a crazy thing to say because it's just so diverse. But I had a very close look at what one might call African conceptions of value. Mm-hmm. And how that may be different from so-called Western conceptions of value. Typical tradition Western conceptions of value might be described as what you might call positivistic. Put simply, it's a case of, I only believe it if I see it.
Yep.
And I only count it if I can count it. I only count what can be counted. Now, when you look at Africa, not everything's been counted. Africa presents, firstly, a vast array of so-called countables that haven't been counted, but furthermore, in many areas in Africa, the idea of value is not as positivistic. It's not so reductionistic. Africa doesn't just value things that you can fit in a spreadsheet. Consider, for example, and this is not the case all across Africa, but in large parts of Africa, consider, for example, just the notion of the ancestors. Once again, it's not relevant tangible in all parts of Africa, but it's certainly, when I worked in London, we never discussed the ancestors. Let's say it like that, right? Whereas, I live in Africa now, it comes up from time to time. Yeah. So think about the idea that to live a good life, if one follows a belief system where ancestors play a role, to live a good life means firstly to be connected with the ancestors. And so in Africa, the idea of connectedness with each other, as well as with previous generations, is a much more prevalent philosophical idea. Now, if I walk with respect to the ancestors, what happens is that I am living my life in such a way that I will become a good future ancestor. That means that the demographic explosion that we're about to experience represents the group of people to whom I will be an ancestor.
Okay.
Now, I challenge you to have this conversation in a boardroom in London. They'll say, where in the spreadsheet are you seeing this? This is not value. I can't value this. I can't put, how many decimal points do I use for this? And so I'm not saying we've cracked it, but I am saying that I think we're starting to have a deeper appreciation for so-called First Nation knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, alternative conceptions of value. And the way that the West has valued things traditionally has been frankly bizarre. That a company can have a high market capitalization and at the same time, be enormously damaging to a local population and to the ecological system. How is that possible? In an African conception of value, I'm arguing in my paper, perhaps even corporate valuation practices should change to incorporate not a crude market capitalization version of company valuation, but a social and ecologically adjusted enterprise valuation model. Put very bluntly, your valuation must be compromised by any external damage that your organization is causing. And so I think Africa also brings this amazing ancient wisdom and richness, a wealth of perspective that may help us to move into a future where, frankly, outdated Western valuation models no longer rule the day. We can already see they're not working.
So it's interesting you mentioned that, because I read an article. I need to look at where I read it. I'll be honest, I don't have it off the top of my head, but a country like Tibet, and when I say disputed country of Tibet, let's put it that way, depending on which part of the political spectrum you sit on. Part of their GDP, if you want to call it that, is they consider the inhabitants' well-being, citizens' well-being. So they count number of hospital days, the number of sick days, all of those into the well-being of the actual country. And that it's also a little bit of a paradigm shift there, as to go, okay, well, that's a part of the business or part of the country and the people's lives that we haven't necessarily taken into consideration, but it plays a huge part. And you can relate that directly into a financial system of saying how much business was potentially lost due to health, et cetera, et cetera. It would be interesting to be able to look at some of the frameworks that you propose and go, right, how do we quantify that? And again, I'm using my Western sort of thinking, going, well, okay, well, give me something tangible. How do I measure that? Is that something that how easy is it? Or does it mean, again, reinventing the entire wheel? Or is it something that we can use to build on currently?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great example, and I think Bhutan was perhaps the first country to introduce that, the idea of a global happiness index rather than just
that's the one.
a GDP. And many other countries have followed suit. And, New Zealand very recently famously declared their intentions to do a similar thing. And so I think this idea is growing around the planet that notions of value need to be revisited. We need new paradigms. That GDP as a metric system of value in an economy may have a modicum of value, but in fact is a very crude measurement instrument, mainly because it uses averages, and it labors under the delusion that averages mean that everyone will benefit. It's clear now that they will not. And so a shift towards alternative conceptions of value, as I argue in my paper. But yes, you're right, within the context of alternative metric systems or systems of measurement, which include happiness, particularly well-being, and all of that within the context of so-called sharing and circular economic systems that have a sensitivity to sociological well-being and indeed to ecological well-being. Even if you are the most brutal capitalist, you are deluded to think that you can exploit the finite resources of the earth in an infinite way. I mean, even the most traditional economic thinker must surely recognize that a growth model that's largely about extraction, in which all the possible benefit is internalized into the organization and all the possible damage is externalized into the society and the ecosystem, is inherently an unsustainable system. So even if you have a philosophical problem, you must surely, even with the most basic rational mind, recognize that the current system cannot be perpetuated.
Yeah. From an African content side of things, or continent side of things, is it something that you call for perhaps, or do you see a downfall with regards to things like open borders, open skies, really being able to again, because of the colonial background, that factionalism side of things, it's moved the continent literally into that space where previously it was around that collaboration, the cohesion in the small groupings. Obviously, from a population side of things, the explosion, that's going to be more difficult. But does it mean political systems need to change? When you relate to finance system, there's going to be political systems in play. Does it mean that we redraw the map of Africa? Is that something that you think would contribute to? Would that help?
Yes, I think it would help, and in fact, it's most countries in Africa have already agreed. If you mean that, metaphorically.
Yeah.
So if you look at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, for example, ratified now by an increasing number of countries, this is about exploring the economic opportunity from a continent with, let's call it, fluid economic borders. Mm-hmm. As things stand at the moment, only around 16% of the total African GDP is intra-African trade. Sure. Isn't that a staggering number? Now, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that number is just going to explode. It is one of the most powerful economic opportunities that will allow African nations to trade with each other. Yes, of course. If they do so with traditional Western economic models, they may fall prey to the same traps.
Yeah.
But I think that there's an awakening in Africa. And I think Africa is very, very interestingly poised to lead the world in an alternative paradigm in the financial system. And I don't say that only with the philosophical ambition as Nkrumah did in the late 1950s. Yeah. I say that because African people have a different paradigm of value. And while that may not be true in every individual case, it is certainly in the complexion of Africa much more true than in any other part in the world, in my view. So the idea, of course, of free trade areas is expanding. And just very recently, we saw RCEP. And in Asian countries, sensing the same idea, that if we can simplify trade in geographical regions, we will unlock enormous economic opportunity. Now consider the alternative of a Western country charging into Africa, flying in its expats, launching its company at the local convention center with doves and balloons and sandwiches and t-shirts and half-naked acrobats, and bringing in its own expat teams, extracting what's available, not beneficiating the local community, listing the organization on a foreign bourse, and after 50 or 60 years, leaving the remains for Africans to deal with. That kind of model, I can tell you, people of Africa have had absolutely enough of it.
Again, I think this is, in listening to what you're saying, and again, I'm going to come back to what you said in 2008. Oh, but in 2018, where we sit in that space as South Africa of we can go down one of two roads. And what I'm hearing at the moment is very similar in terms of that. We can continue down the way we're going. It's not going to be scalable. It's not going to be sustainable in the long term. And in the short term, you're going to perhaps potentially see further tensions boiling up. And we've seen incidents in northern Mozambique with regards to factionalism. We've seen in Ethiopia. We've seen in many countries over the last 20 odd years that now Western countries feel now they need to go in to sort out the political issues and get involved in that type of thing. Or alternatively, we can relook at and reinvent, push the reset button, like we said, and create a new framework, whether it's social, economic, from a climate change perspective, from youth development, all of those things, ability to make new frameworks. Here's my question from a leadership side of things. And again, from a NineLeaders side, this is where we really focus on going, how do we do that? What are the skills going to be required to take us into that new world potentially? Is it more around that empathy, that collaboration, the cohesion? Where do you see leadership playing a role? Because again, ultimately, it's going to be that leadership that drives it forward. Or alternatively, am I still thinking in the old hierarchical method of your chief executive officer, your CFO, your chief financial officer? That's very militaristic pyramid scheme type thing. Is that even changing? Is that framework even changing?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of character to change, and certain types of changes are more likely than others. And I think change is increasingly becoming a science. But in terms of the competencies specifically that you ask about for leaders, I was privileged to be a member of the International Labour Organization's panel of experts on the future of work. And a lot of my work has to do with paradigms and models of thinking. So futures thinking, creative thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, design thinking, innovation, and so on. And the paper of mine that they published was about what I call transitionary competencies. In other words, the kind of skills that leaders need to walk across the bridge to an alternative future. We can debate what that alternative future might be, but I argue that there is a set of critical competencies that we require as leaders in order to walk across that bridge. And one of those is a kind of alternative intellectual value chain that is not as reductionistic as a kind of extractive business value chain, but thinks about a value chain such as imagination. And I do think that imagination will emerge as a formal competence for leaders in the future. And the reason that I believe that is that the current future is untenable, and that you cannot produce alternative futures by simply projecting the current future and hoping for the best. So you have to imagine alternative futures. So imagination is an important first competence and step in that intellectual value chain. Then you need some anticipation, some futures thinking, some strategic foresight to think about what's more likely to occur, where the probable futures might lie. Then you need creativity to respond to what you've now observed in your imagination and anticipation. And then you need innovation to make that work in the real world, commercialize it or whatever. So imagination, anticipation, creativity, innovation as one of the kind of intellectual value chains of competencies that you might need to take the future somewhere else. Now, that's an example of something you might say, that's crazy. There's never going to be, university is never going to teach people, 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, you've got to double in imagination. I think that's extremely possible.
Yeah.
And not only possible, I think it's essential. Because unless we have alternative conceptions of the future, it'll be very difficult for us to move towards alternative futures. The present tends to perpetuate itself. We call it status quo bias.
Yeah.
The present makes more of itself. The system is designed to keep itself alive. That's why it has its structures and rules. So to move to an alternative system must mean that you must imagine what those alternatives might be. And so I have a number of these kind of competencies that I think leaders will need. Another one of them is what I've called experience transcendence. This is the idea that in the past, we got an awful lot of our courage as leaders from experience. The fact that I was experienced, this is the foundation of my wisdom. But that really comes from a time when everyone had more or less the same experience. I mean, let me give you a stupid example. We were watching, at the end of last year, we were watching, I think it was cricket, with my son, 11 years of age, and my father. And halfway through the game, there's a ball right up in the air, and there's a South African under the ball, and of course he drops the catch. My 11-year-old jumps up in frustration and shouts, "I've never seen anything like this in my life." It made me wonder, well, firstly, what life are you talking about? But it made me wonder, where does this expression come from?
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like this in my life. What does that mean? And I think it comes from a time where everybody had more or less the same experience. And the person with the most experience could say, well, if I've never seen this in my life, then it must be foreign and therefore unacceptable.
Yeah.
But where we are now is that we have AI and we have big data. So if you're a winemaker and you have a Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard, explaining some of my own passions here, how long does it take you to get 20 years of experience as a winemaker of your vineyard? Well, it takes 20 years. But if you have data of 1,000 other vineyards in the same climate with the same varietal, how long does it take now to get 1,000 years of experience?
Sure.
It takes 1 year. So in other words, the idea of experience is being revisited. That is not to say that experience doesn't matter. But I think the way of sense making from experience is changing dramatically. And so the fact that my experience doesn't reflect what you suggest, that's completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
That's no longer the screen for whether that is acceptable or not. And I need some alternative intellectual competencies to process this idea that I will be continuously bombarded with alternative ideas that may, in fact, be superior than the ones that I can glean from my own experience. And so those are just two examples that I think are the interesting ones that we haven't really grasped. I also, just by the way, in a list of 10, added number 11, which is that in the future we need to unlearn our desire for making lists. Because firstly, lists in the future will never end. And
Morne, it's data. We can use data. We can make decisions based off the data that we've got in those lists.
No, it's an interesting question you must say about data, because in the science of the future, what's really interesting is where you get your data from. Because if you think about it, a decision is always made in the present. It cannot be made anywhere else. Even if you make it tomorrow, it will be the present then. And so it's based on what? Well, it's based on experience. I've already spoken about that. And now increasing volumes of data. But where did you get that data?
Yeah.
Well, it comes from a little thing called the past. Okay, so you're making it in the present with all the noise of the day. It comes from the past, a place you'll never visit again. What are you using it for? Well, you're using it for the future. a place you've never visited before. So I think the way we think about data at the moment, big data, it's amazing, and AI can really leverage it. But I think increasingly we're going to start thinking about data of the future. And imagination is an example of data of the future.
Is that also not a scary thought in terms of if we look at the current framework and the current structures that we have in play, and throwing big data into that is the control of data. So am I in control of the data stream that I get, or is somebody pushing data to me that wants to drive an agenda? So I mean, don't talk about 1984 with George Orwell, but is that a possibility if we don't do this in the right way?
Yeah, I think it's very serious, and I don't think it's even a debate. You're not in control, I'm sorry to tell you, Andrew, and neither am I.
Yeah.
And but I think that the relief to me is if you have the right kind of intellect, I think, for the future, which we all need to work on, then no one's in control.
Mm.
And that's a little bit of the comfort. You could say in a way that all data is propaganda. All data is propaganda because they must have a boundary. So someone has to say, okay, that's enough data, or that's enough sources, or that's enough samples, or that's enough of a variety of partial views that we're gathering. And whatever the motivation is for that cutoff of the boundary, to my mind, that represents propaganda of decision making.
It's always been fascinating to me. I had a leader once who always said to me, "The numbers don't lie." And yeah, absolutely. But it's very often the people behind the numbers that wants to paint some sort of picture that do lie. So you've got to be able to, back to your point earlier, be able to analyze as an individual, that design thinking of going, right, okay, well, what are the possibilities? What is the information that I do currently have? George Bezos put out an article, I think it was now in his latest company review, going, as a decision-making process as a leader, I need to make decisions quickly, and I'm never going to have the 100% of the information. So I need to be able to make, if I've got 70% of the information, that allows me to make a decision right there and then, and there will be always that 30%, which could be right, could be wrong, and that'll only be telling time. But it's really about moving your people to a place where of consensus and collaboration again, of saying, well, we might disagree, but we commit. So I just sort of find that very interesting as well from that perspective of that collaboration together. Morne, it's been absolutely...
idea.
Yeah. Sorry, say again?
No, if I just have a quick response to that, the numbers don't lie. It's really fascinating because in a way, what you've done so eloquently there is bring us back to this idea of conceptions of value in Africa. And even Einstein said, not everything that can be counted matters. Not everything that matters can be counted. And I think that it's true that the numbers don't lie, but it's a very selective truth. And in that sense, the numbers always lie. Because even on a company valuation, when you say, I can see in so-called black and white on the balance sheet, using, let's say, market capitalization, this is the value of my organization.
Yeah.
My argument in my paper is that is a very narrow selection of the facts, and that there are externalities that need to be factored, I think, into the valuation of your company.
Yeah.
And I think that may introduce a new era of how we think about valuing organizations and how organizations value society.
So I'm gonna throw a question back at you that you mentioned earlier. As a futurist, do you tend to be on the positive side of going, well, the future is potentially rosy, or are you on the negative side going, well, we're in a bit of a storm, and if we don't, where do you sit? Do you sit on the fence because of that?
Well, I'll tell you, technically speaking, in our science, both optimism and pessimism are examples of intellectual bias.
Yeah.
So in other words, they're both errors in judgment. You strive, of course, for something that is utterly unachievable, which is to somehow get in inverted commas, realistic objective perspective, as if such a thing is ever possible. Having said that, most of our work is with business.
Mm.
And one of the things I really like about business, and I must point out that as much as I'm sort of critiquing valuation models, for example, in business, I am a big supporter of business. I think business is a very important, a critical role player in the shaping of alternative future societies.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really love about business is that, most business people, most good business people are future oriented, and they're interested in shaping the future, not just in describing the future. There's an enormous wealth of innovation in so much of the DNA of business. And for that reason, most good business people are optimistic. Now, in order to find positive alternative futures, you must believe that those positive alternative futures are to be found and can in fact be created. So I'm terribly sorry to admit that I am a bit of an optimist, Andrew.
Fantastic. Well, that's great to hear. I think that's also, I think, in these times, it's very easy to just dwell on what is the current here and now. And I think even to that what you spoke about from paradigm shift is going, right, okay, so what does that future look like from an individual perspective to a community, to a country, to a continent? And I think there's an expression I heard during the 90s, which always stuck with me, is that no great thing has been done within the confines of the accepted norm. If we are to create that future, if we to create that sustainable future, it's going to have to be doing something differently to what we've always done. Morne, it's been absolutely fascinating. I thank you so much for your time. I definitely think we're going to have to be back in every 6 months. We're going to have to do a check-in to see how far are we, because ideally we don't want to be sitting in 50 years' time with the paper that you wrote today, similar to the paper that was written in 1972. Let's hope that really there's an awakening of that understanding, and that we can create a future that's beneficial for all. So thank you very, very much. I really do appreciate it.
Real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care.